Some of these recipes, I mean, not to get too graphic, but one of my favorites in my sick, twisted way was I was reading a recipe and I was like, oh, this sounds great. It was milk and sugar and cinnamon. And I was like, oh, what is this a recipe for? This sounds great. And it turns out that it was, oh, shoot, an enema. It was an enema. They were, yeah, milk and sugar. And I was like, oh, no, that's the wrong end. I didn't want that.
That last treatment took a bit of a turn. So,
Yes,
that's quite
exactly.
nice.
Yeah. Yep. Definitely not great.
One would hope that with all of this trial and error driven by the matriarchs within the household, that you would eventually get some treatment that worked quite well. But was that not the case?
You would think that. And people did get better. So you have to imagine that something worked, whether or not it was the actual medicine that they were being given or it just they waited long enough to get better. There were things that worked, but again, I would have to be a lot more trials in order to really understand how it worked or why it worked or something like that. Yeah, there was Jean Weems did really like to give her children licorice when they were sick. I have to imagine that at least in a placebo way, if you like the taste of licorice, it made you feel better when you had a cold.
Yes, but I suppose you do have to bear in mind, were people being cured by treatments or were they just surviving it? An example that comes to mind for me was Benjamin Rush, one of the founding fathers of the US, who during a particularly bad outbreak of yellow fever in Philadelphia became a huge advocate for bloodletting and said that anyone who survived removing 80% of their blood was cured. And I haven't lost any patient who has been letted 8 to 12 times. And of course, that is the course of the infection, about 8 to 14 days, less of the cure and more surviving the treatment.
Yes, definitely an element of that. It's definitely a bit of a tangent, but it is really interesting when people say like, oh, I want to go back in time and like see what it's really like. I'm like, no, you don't. Like, you don't want to go back in time. It was kind of awful if you got sick. It was a lot of wait and see. And I mean, also it's really interesting. There has been some work done fairly recently by a scholar called Hannah Newton about actually the process of getting better. And to some extent, there were times when people didn't get better. They had long-lasting effects of whatever disease it was. And the early modern conception of when somebody was better was just when they were able to move around. And so, I mean, if somebody still had shortness of breath or anything like that, they were still better, but they weren't cured. Definitely wouldn't want to go back in time.
But that does bring an interesting point. When we think about treatment centuries ago, we always consider acute treatment because surely if you don't cure it, you're going to die. But were there any chronic diseases that people were treating?
There certainly were. Get instances of asthma and things like that, and unfortunately epilepsy. But it is interesting. You've just made me think, when you look at recipe books and things like that, it's not so much epilepsy that they're treating. It's like that one recipe. It's the convulsion fits themselves. So they're trying to cure the instance of the disease rather than the longevity of the disease. But yeah, people didn't really understand it as a certain disease for a long period of time. They just said that the person was sickly. I mean, even when you think about, again, with witchcraft, there was a sort of concept that witches were giving people the falling sickness, which in modern parlance would be epilepsy to some extent, although falling sickness is kind of an umbrella term. But they were saying that those convulsion fits were caused by somebody bewitching them. So yeah, it was the instance of what was actually occurring rather than just the disease itself.